He was dead, and that room suddenly became a battlefield. Before the ink on the will had even dried, his son sneered at me as if I were some kind of freeloader who had lived off his generosity for years. He won. He thought so. Everyone in the room thought so, and for a moment I almost believed it too. But Walter, the man I had loved in silence, the man who had watched it all without a word, had prepared something no one in that room could have ever imagined. Please comment with the city you're viewing from so I know how far this story has progressed. And stay until the end, because this is a story about something money can never buy, the truth. I didn't cry at the funeral. People noticed. I saw it in the way their eyes slid toward me and then away, politely, the way you look away from something you've already judged. Walter's cousin Marlene leaned close to the woman beside her, some distant relative whose name I'd never learned in 5 years of family gatherings, and whispered something behind her hand. I didn't have to hear it to know what it was. She's not even crying, cold woman, always was. I stood at the graveside in a black dress Walter had bought me 2 birthdays ago, and I held a single white lily because that was what the florist had and I hadn't had the presence of mind to order anything specific. And I looked at the mahogany casket being lowered into the red Texas earth, and I felt something too complicated and too private to call grief and too enormous to call anything else. Walter Hayes had died on a Tuesday morning in early March, quietly, the way he had done almost everything in his life. The hospice nurse had called me at 6:14. I'd been sitting in the kitchen drinking coffee I couldn't taste because I hadn't been sleeping well for weeks, and the coffee was more ritual than remedy. I drove to the facility alone. I sat with him for 2 hours after. I held his hand, which was still warm for longer than I expected, and I talked to him about nothing in particular. The weather, the way the light was coming through the blinds, a cardinal I'd seen on the porch railing the morning before. It seemed important not to make it into something grand. Walter had never liked grand gestures. His son Brandon arrived 40 minutes after Walter was gone. He walked into the room, looked at his father's body, looked at me and said, "When's the lawyer coming?" That was the moment. That was when I understood, with the kind of bone-deep clarity you only reach after years of smaller understandings, exactly what the next few days were going to look like. I met Walter Hayes 6 years before he died. I was 51, recently widowed myself. My first husband, Dennis, had passed from a heart attack that came without warning and left me with a paid-off house, a modest savings account, and the peculiar disorientation of being middle-aged and alone in a world that had been organized entirely around being part of a pair. I wasn't looking for Walter. I wasn't looking for anyone. I was at a charity auction for the county hospital, the kind of event you attend because a colleague has a spare ticket and you have nothing better to do on a Friday evening. And Walter Hayes was standing near the bar, looking the way powerful men sometimes look when they've spent long enough being powerful that the performance of it has exhausted them. Tired, a little bored, like he was waiting for something to be over. He was 73, lean and weathered, with the kind of face that had probably been handsome in a conventional way decades ago and had since become something better. Specific, earned. He had a scar on his chin from a fence post he'd run into at age 12. He told me that on the 3rd date, and I loved the specificity of it. A fence post, age 12. Not a bar fight, not a war story, just a boy running and not watching where he was going. We were married 14 months after we met. Small ceremony. I wore ivory. His son Brandon flew in from Houston, shook my hand with exactly enough pressure to communicate contempt while maintaining plausible deniability, and spent the reception talking loudly to his associates about a development deal near Corpus Christi. I understood from the beginning that Brandon saw me as a problem. I was not the first problem. Walter's first wife, Brandon's mother, Patricia, had died 15 years before I appeared, and in the intervening years Brandon had grown accustomed to a certain kind of access. Not just to his father's money, though that was certainly part of it. Access to Walter's time, his attention, his decisions. Walter was the kind of man whose approval meant something, and Brandon had spent a lifetime performing for it without ever quite earning it, and the performance had curdled into resentment that he'd learned to dress up as filial devotion. When I entered the picture, I disrupted the dynamic. Not intentionally. I didn't push Brandon out or poison Walter against him. I simply was there, present in a way that Walter seemed to find, after many years of a certain kind of loneliness, genuinely comforting. And Brandon could not forgive me for that. In the 5 years of our marriage, Brandon did the following things. He forgot to include me in the family photograph taken at Walter's 75th birthday party. I was standing 12 feet away when someone said, "Just family for this one," and nobody corrected it. He referred to me in my presence as Walter's situation, as in, we need to talk about Walter's situation before we finalize anything. He said this to his lawyer at a dinner I had cooked in my own kitchen about an estate planning discussion I had not been invited to and only walked in on by accident. He told me once, just once, but once was enough, that the ranch had been in the Hayes family for 4 generations, and that he intended for it to remain in the Hayes family, and that he hoped I understood what he meant by that. He said it pleasantly, with a smile that didn't touch anything above his jaw. I told Walter about that conversation. Walter listened. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm going to handle that." And he did something. I never knew exactly what, because Brandon was notably more careful with his words around me for the next 6 months. But careful is not the same as changed, and I was under no illusions. Walter's health began declining in the last 18 months of his life. It wasn't a single catastrophic event. It was the accumulation of smaller ones. A surgery that went well, but left him slower. A winter respiratory infection that stripped 20 pounds he couldn't afford to lose. The quiet mathematics of a body that had worked hard for 8 decades and was beginning to present its invoice. Brandon moved fast. I watched it happen with the particular kind of helplessness that comes from understanding exactly what you're seeing and having almost no way to stop it. Brandon began flying in from Houston more frequently. He brought folders. He brought his personal attorney, a man named Garrett Cole, who wore pocket squares and spoke in the measured tones of someone who had spent a career being paid to make bad news sound reasonable. There were meetings in Walter's study that I was not asked to join, conversations that stopped when I entered rooms, documents that appeared on the kitchen table and were swept away before I could look at them properly. I was not stupid. I was not passive. I spoke to Walter directly. "Brandon is pushing you toward something," I said one evening. We were sitting on the back porch watching the last of the light go out of the sky over the south pasture. Walter had a blanket over his knees because he got cold faster than he used to, and he was holding the particular stillness that meant he was listening even when he appeared to be doing nothing. "He's always pushing toward something," Walter said. "Walter?" He looked at me. His eyes were the same color they'd always been. This particular shade of gray-green that I'd never found a good word for. And they were clear. Whatever was failing in his body hadn't reached his mind. "I know what I'm doing, Evelyn," he said. "Do you know what he's doing?" A long pause. "I know exactly what he's doing." And then he reached over and put his hand over mine. And he didn't say anything else. And I didn't push because there was something in his voice that meant trust me in a way I had learned over 5 years to recognize. I trusted him. I don't know if that was wisdom or weakness, probably both. Most trust is. The will reading was scheduled for the Friday after the funeral, in the offices of Harmon, Pierce, and Associates on the 4th floor of a building in downtown Denton that smelled of carpet cleaner and old coffee. I dressed carefully that morning, not because I was performing anything, but because Walter had always appreciated it when I dressed carefully. He noticed details, quiet things, the way the collar of a blouse sat, or whether you'd chosen the shoes that were comfortable or the ones that were worth the discomfort. And the habit persisted even now that there was no one left who would notice in the same way. The conference room had a long table, real wood, and a window that looked out over the street. 8 people were already seated when I arrived. Brandon, occupying the chair directly to the right of the head of the table as though he'd staked it. Brandon's wife, Connie, who was blonde and meticulous and always looked at me with an expression of such careful neutrality that it was practically aggressive. Garrett Cole, Brandon's attorney, with his pocket square. Walter's younger sister Dorothy and her husband Frank, both in their late 70s, both seeming slightly lost. 2 of Walter's business associates, whose names I always confused, Russ and Phil or Phil and Russ, and a woman I didn't recognize who turned out to be Walter's accountant. David Harmon, the estate attorney, sat at the head of the table with a leather folder in front of him, and the expression of a man who has delivered difficult news before and has made peace with his role in the process. I sat at the far end of the table, which put me directly across from the window. I could see the street below. A woman was walking a dog. A delivery truck was double parked. The ordinary Tuesday morning world continuing its business while Walter Hayes's life was divided up above it. "Thank you all for being here," David Harmon said. He had a deliberate voice, precise without being cold. Walter was thorough in his preparations, and I want to honor that by being thorough in how I present this. I'll ask everyone to allow me to complete the reading before we open the floor to questions. Brandon leaned back slightly in his chair, comfortable, already certain. The will was thorough in the way that everything Walter did was thorough. There were bequests to longtime employees, amounts that were modest by Hayes family standards but meaningful to the people receiving them. A bequest to the County Hospital Foundation. Several items of personal property to Dorothy, including their mother's china and a pocket watch that had belonged to their father. I watched Brandon through all of this. He sat with his hands folded on the table, patient, wearing the performance of a man being gracious about waiting for the inevitable. Connie had a legal pad and was making small notes. With respect to the primary estate, David Harmon continued, Walter has directed the following disposition. He turned a page. The Hayes Ranch property, including all structures, water rights, and livestock, is bequeathed in its entirety to Brandon Walter Hayes. Brandon nodded once, measured, but his jaw shifted, and I saw the satisfaction break through for just a second before he controlled it. The Hayes group of companies, the development holdings, the commercial properties, and the investment portfolios are bequeathed to Brandon Walter Hayes, subject to existing operating agreements and financial obligations. Of course, Brandon said quietly, to no one in particular. Connie wrote something on her legal pad. There are additional cash bequests and structured distributions that will be covered in a supplementary document, David Harmon continued, and he went on for several more minutes, and I listened to Walter's life being sorted into columns, and I felt the heaviness of it settling over me. And then David Harmon came to my name. To Evelyn Marie Hayes, his wife, Walter bequeaths the lakeside property at Cutter's Bend, including the cabin and all structures thereon, along with a financial instrument to cover standard maintenance costs for a period of 10 years. The room was very quiet. "That's it?" Brandon said. The measured patience was gone. He said it with the blankness of someone who hadn't expected to need to disguise the response. "The financial instrument is—" "No, I understand the numbers. Brandon straightened. That's the total extent of it? The Cutter's Bend property? That is what the primary document specifies, yes." Brandon looked at me for the first time since I'd entered the room. Not with cruelty, exactly. It was more unsettling than that. He looked at me with something close to pity, the kind that's really just contempt wearing a softer coat, like he was almost sorry that I had ever believed there was going to be anything different. "Well," he said. He picked up his pen. "All right." "Well, Cutter's Bend. I knew the property. I had been there twice, early in our marriage when Walter had taken me on a drive through the eastern part of the county and shown me various things he owned, the way some men show you photographs or tell you about their past as a form of intimacy. The cabin at Cutter's Bend was aging. The dock had a board that needed replacing. The lake itself was pretty in a quiet, unfussy way, ringed with scrub oak and cedar, the kind of place that asked nothing of you. I had not known, in those 2 visits, that it was particularly significant. It didn't appear to be. There was no grand view, no special feature. It was the kind of property that sits at the edge of a man's holdings and is neither sold nor developed, just kept, the way you keep certain things without being able to explain exactly why. I sat across from Brandon's satisfaction, and I thought, Walter left me a fishing cabin. And then, very quietly, somewhere underneath that thought, I remembered what Walter had said on the back porch. "I know what I'm doing, Evelyn." I held on to that. I didn't know why, but I held on to it. The meeting was closing. David Harmon was doing the procedural work of endings, summarizing next steps, mentioning timelines for asset transfers, noting that his office would be in contact with all parties. Garrett Cole was leaning close to Brandon's ear, murmuring something in the low, efficient way of men who charge by the hour. Dorothy reached over and briefly covered my hand with hers. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Brandon was already standing. He had his jacket straightened and his folder under his arm, and the manner of a man who was about to walk out of one meeting and directly into the next, the efficient onward motion of someone who has gotten what they came for. "Evelyn," he said, pausing at my end of the table. He said it with an almost generous air, like he was making an effort. "The cabin's a decent size. You could make something comfortable out of it. Maybe rent it out in summer, recoup a bit." He paused. "I'd have thought, after everything, he would have been more—" He trailed off as if reconsidering the sentence, but the sentence had already done its work. "More what?" I said. He shook his head slightly. "Never mind. I'm sorry for your loss, Evelyn." He walked toward the door. And then David Harmon said, "Mr. Hayes, I need to ask you to remain seated." Brandon stopped. Mom. The room rearranged itself. Brandon turned. Connie looked up from her legal pad. Garrett Cole's hand stilled on his folder. David Harmon was looking at his phone, at a message that had come in. I could see from across the table that something had arrived, though I couldn't read it. He read it twice. His expression did not change exactly, but something around his eyes shifted, the way a man looks when he's just had a large piece of information dropped into a situation he thought he already understood. "There is a supplementary document," David Harmon said carefully, "that Walter specified was not to be opened until the conclusion of the primary reading and upon receipt of a particular authorization." He set the phone down. "I've just received that authorization." "What does that mean?" Brandon said. He hadn't moved from his position near the door. "It means there's a second document, a sealed file that was held outside of the standard estate record, at Walter's specific direction." David Harmon opened a drawer in the credenza behind him. He removed a sealed envelope, not a folder, just a plain envelope, cream-colored, sealed with wax the way old correspondence was sealed, and placed it on the table. Brandon walked slowly back to his seat. The room was quiet enough that I could hear the traffic sounds from the street 4 floors below. "Walter was very deliberate about the sequencing," David Harmon said. "He wanted the primary document read first. He wanted everyone to hear what was in the primary document." He paused. "And then he wanted this opened." He broke the seal. I have thought about that moment many times since. The specific quality of the silence as the envelope opened. The way Brandon's hand had moved, almost involuntarily, to the table's edge, gripping it. The way Connie had set her pen down. Dorothy very quietly reached for her husband's hand. I sat with my hands in my lap and I thought, "I know what I'm doing, Evelyn." David Harmon unfolded the document inside. He read it to himself first, perhaps 30 seconds, no more. And during those 30 seconds, I watched his face, and I saw something there that I couldn't name at the time. Something that mixed professional composure with what, in any other context, I would have called something close to wonder. He set the document flat on the table. "This is a codicil to Walter's primary will," he said, "executed and notarized 8 months ago. It amends and expands the terms of the primary document in one significant respect." He looked up. "It pertains to the Cutter's Bend property." "What about it?" Brandon said. "The Cutter's Bend property," David Harmon said, "is not simply a lakeside cabin. It includes, pursuant to a deed of mineral and subsurface rights recorded with the county in 1987 and held continuously by Walter Hayes since that date, ownership of the subsurface rights to approximately 4,700 acres of land in the surrounding area." The delivery truck on the street below had moved. I could see a gap where it had been. The codicil notes that the subsurface rights in question include an area that was assessed by a geological survey firm in the past 14 months as containing significant reserves of natural gas. Walter does not specify the assessed value in the document itself, but he directs that his attorney provide the relevant assessments to Mrs. Hayes at this meeting. David Harmon slid a second, thinner document across the table to me. I picked it up. I looked at the number on the page. I set it down. I picked it up again and looked at it a second time because I had apparently not trusted my own reading of it. "That can't be right," Brandon said. He was on his feet. That property it's always been, you're telling me—" "Mr. Hayes," David Harmon said quietly, "I'd ask you to let me finish." Brandon sat down. He looked like a man whose chair had been pulled out from under him, and he was only just registering that the floor was where he was now sitting. "Fiti tuki asamatfete." David Harmon read the rest of the codicil. Walter's language, as filtered through the formal structure of legal prose, was still recognizably his, precise, unhurried, without performance. He explained that the subsurface rights at Cutter's Bend had been acquired decades earlier, when the land around it was considered marginal and the purchase had attracted no particular attention. He had renewed the mineral rights filings consistently, quietly, over the years. He had done this deliberately and privately because he had learned, over a long life in business, that the most valuable things are often the ones that don't look valuable. He wrote that he had commissioned the geological survey after a conversation with a colleague about shifting assessments of natural gas potential in that region. The results had confirmed what the colleague had suggested. He had sat with that information for several months. And then he wrote, and David Harmon read this in the same measured voice he had used throughout, that the allocation of his estate had been deliberate and specific, and that he wanted everyone in that room to understand why. Brandon has always known what things are worth on the surface, Walter wrote. He is his father's son in that regard. I leave him the ranch and the businesses because they are visible. And visible things are what Brandon has always wanted most. I leave Evelyn the thing underneath because she is the only person I have known in the last decade who wanted nothing from me that I couldn't freely give. She never asked what I was worth. She never calculated. She sat with me through 2 surgeries and drove me to appointments she never mentioned to anyone else, and brought me coffee every morning and talked to me about nothing, and that nothing was everything. I leave her the thing underneath because she is the only one who would have been content with the surface. The room was completely silent. Connie was not writing on her legal pad anymore. Brandon's face had gone through several things and had arrived at an expression I had never seen on him before and could not entirely read. It was not anger exactly. It was more like the look of a man who has been holding a winning hand across a table and has just watched someone else turn over their cards. Dorothy made a small sound that might have been a laugh and might have been something else entirely. I sat at the end of the table with the assessment document in my hands and Walter's voice in my ears, and I thought about a fishing cabin on a quiet lake, and a dock with a board that needed replacing, and a man who noticed details and planned carefully and had told me, on a back porch in the last year of his life, that he knew what he was doing. He had known. He had known exactly what he was doing. And somewhere in the machinery of the grief I'd been carrying since 6:14 on a Tuesday morning, something shifted. Not resolved, not erased, but shifted into something I didn't yet have a name for. Something that felt, underneath all the loss, like being known. Outside the window, the street was still doing what streets do. Ordinary and continuous and entirely indifferent to the fact that Walter Hayes had, from the quiet remove of death, just rearranged the world. Brennan didn't say anything for a long time after David Harmon finished reading. That was the thing nobody talks about when they describe moments like that one, the silence that follows the detonation. People imagine there would be shouting, or tears, or some immediate volcanic reaction. But Brandon Hayes sat very still in his chair, and his hands were flat on the table, and he looked at the middle distance the way you look when your brain is running faster than your face can keep up with. It was Garrett Cole who broke it first. "We'll need to review the document," he said. Lawyer's reflex. When you don't know what to say you need to review something. "Of course," David Harmon said pleasantly. "The provenance of the mineral rights filing is on file with the county recorder's office. Has been since 1987. It's a matter of public record, Mr. Cole." Walter was careful about that. Garrett Cole wrote something on his own legal pad. I noticed his handwriting was very small. The handwriting of a man who measures what he puts on paper. Brandon finally moved. He picked up his pen, set it down, picked it up again. He was looking at the assessment document that David Harmon had passed across the table, the one with the number on it, the one I'd had to read twice. "This figure," he said. "This is the assessed estimate, not a guarantee." "That's correct. It's a preliminary geological assessment. The actual value would depend on extraction agreements, market conditions. It could be less." "It could," David Harmon said. "It could also be more." The survey firm used conservative methodology at Walter's request. The words "at Walter's request" landed in the room with a particular weight. Everything in this document had been at Walter's request. That was the part Brandon was working through. I could see it. Not just the numbers, but the deliberateness of it. The fact that none of this was accident. "He planned this," Brandon said. Not a question. "Walter was a thorough man," David Harmon said. Brandon looked at me then. Really looked, for the first time in that meeting, maybe for the first time in years. I held his gaze because I had learned, a long time before Walter died, that looking away from Brandon Hayes cost more than looking at him. "Did you know?" he said. "No," I said. "You're telling me you had no idea." "Brandon." I kept my voice even. "I didn't know. If I had known, you would have known I knew. I'm not built for that kind of patience." It was the most honest thing I said in that room, and I think it was the one thing I told him that he actually believed. The meeting dissolved slowly, the way those things do. There were papers to sign, documents to receipt, procedural formalities that David Harmon moved through with quiet efficiency. Dorothy hugged me on the way out, a real hug, the kind that lasts long enough to mean something. Frank shook my hand and couldn't meet my eyes, which I understood. He was Walter's family, and he was caught between loyalty and shock, and probably a little private grief of his own. The two business associates, it was Phil and Russ, I finally settled it, left quickly. The accountant exchanged a few quiet words with David Harmon, and then she too was gone. Brandon and Garrett Cole stood in the corner of the room speaking in voices low enough that I couldn't hear them. I wasn't trying to. I was gathering my bag, putting on my coat, going through the ordinary mechanics of leaving a room that I wanted to leave. Connie sat at the table and looked at her legal pad and didn't write anything on it. I was at the door when Brandon said my name. "Evelyn." I stopped. I turned around. He was standing with his arms at his sides and his jacket still perfectly pressed, because Brandon was always perfectly pressed. It was one of the things he put real effort into, and his face had rearranged itself into something that I think was meant to read as reasonable. "We should talk," he said. "This week, before anyone makes any decisions." "What decisions would I be making?" "About the property, about how you intend to move forward with it." He paused. "There are implications for the surrounding land. Some of it is adjacent to ranch operations. There are access questions, easement questions. David Harmon's office will be in touch with me about next steps," I said. "I expect your attorney can coordinate with him." A beat. "Of course," Brandon said. The reasonableness thinned just slightly at the edges. "I'm just saying there's no need to make this adversarial. We're family." I looked at him for a moment. "We're family." The man who had called me Walter's situation in my own kitchen. The man who had said all right when the lawyer announced I'd received a fishing cabin, with the tone of someone who had expected worse and been pleasantly surprised. The man who had shown up 40 minutes after his father stopped breathing and asked when the lawyer was coming. "I'll be in touch," I said, and I left. The drive back to the house took 40 minutes. I don't remember most of it. I remember the radio was off and the windows were up, and the Texas countryside was doing that thing it does in early March, where it looks like it can't decide whether to commit to winter or move on, everything brown and gray and yellow-green at the edges. I had the assessment document in my bag. I hadn't looked at it again since the meeting. I wasn't ready to. It felt the way very large news often feels in the immediate aftermath, simultaneously real and unreal, a fact you know to be true and have not yet integrated into the person you were before you knew it. What I kept coming back to, driving those 40 minutes, was not the number. It was the letter. She never asked what I was worth. I had to stop at a red light and press my palm against my sternum for a moment because something in my chest was doing something I couldn't control and didn't want to do in a car on a county road where anyone might see me through the windshield. Walter had written that. Walter, who chose his words the way he chose everything, deliberately, without excess. Walter had written that I had wanted nothing from him that he couldn't freely give, and he had hidden it in a sealed envelope and arranged for it to be read aloud in a room full of people who had spent years watching me and calculating what I was getting out of the arrangement. I thought about all the dinners I'd attended where Connie had smiled at me with that careful neutrality and Brandon had discussed ranch operations around me like I was a piece of furniture that happened to occupy the room. I thought about the family photograph at the 75th birthday party. I thought about sitting in a hospice room at 6 a.m, holding a hand that was still warm. And I thought, Walter saw all of it. That was the thing I hadn't fully known until today. I knew he was perceptive. I knew he noticed more than he said. But you can know something about a person and still be surprised when the proof of it arrives by how complete their attention was. He had seen me. Every ordinary, unperformed, undramatic day of it, he had seen me, and he had remembered, and he had written it down. I drove the rest of the way home, and I sat in the driveway for 10 minutes before I went inside. The calls started the next morning. The first one was from Russ Cafferty, one of the business associates from the meeting. I almost didn't answer. I didn't recognize the number, but I picked up, and Russ spent 12 minutes being carefully friendly in the way that men are carefully friendly when they want something and haven't yet decided how directly to ask for it. He asked how I was holding up. He mentioned that the Hayes Group had some really exciting projects in development. He said, almost as an aside, that if I was ever interested in discussing partnership structures around the Cutter's Bend asset, he had some ideas worth exploring. I told him I'd be in touch. The second call was from a man I didn't know at all, who introduced himself as representing an energy development firm out of Midland. He was brisk and businesslike and made no pretense of condolence. He said his firm had been aware of the subsurface potential in the Cutter's Bend area for some time and was interested in initiating preliminary conversations about a lease arrangement. He used the phrase mutually beneficial 3 times in 90 seconds. I told him I'd need to speak with my attorney. The third call was from Brandon. I let that one go to voicemail. He left a message that was 7 minutes long. He started with condolences, which he delivered with the tone of someone who had practiced them on the drive over and wasn't entirely satisfied with how they'd come out. He moved into what he called a concern about the family legacy. The idea that Walter would have wanted the Hayes assets to remain coherent and unified, and that fragmenting the estate between the ranch operations and the Cutter's Bend mineral rights could create complications he was sure I didn't want to deal with. He suggested we meet for lunch. He suggested it again. He mentioned Connie would love to have me over for dinner sometime. He closed with, I know this has been a lot to process, but we're on the same side here, Evelyn. We've always been on the same side. I stood in the kitchen listening to the voicemail, and I felt something move through me that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite satisfaction. It was something more complicated than any of those. The particular internal weather of a woman who has been quietly underestimated for years and has just watched the accounting of that mistake begin to come due. I deleted the message. I drove out to Cutter's Bend that afternoon. I needed to see it. Not for any practical reason. David Harmon had been clear that nothing needed to happen quickly, that I had time to make decisions and assemble a team and understand the full scope of what I'd been left. But I needed to stand on the land itself. I needed to be in the physical place that Walter had been thinking about when he arranged all of this. The drive took about 50 minutes, out past the edges of Denton and into country that got quieter and wider as you went. The road that turned off toward the lake was unpaved for the last 2 miles, pale limestone gravel that crunched under the tires. The cedar trees came in close on either side and then opened, and there was the lake, gray-green in the afternoon light, still and wide, with the cabin at the edge of it. I parked and got out and stood. The cabin was the same as I remembered, maybe a little more weathered. The paint on the porch railing was peeling in places, and one of the shutters on the east-facing window was slightly off its hinge. The dock extended out over the water, solid-looking, except for that one board I'd noticed years ago, which was still there, slightly raised at one end, waiting for someone to fix it. I walked down to the dock and stood at the end of it. The lake was quiet. A heron stood motionless at the far edge, in the shallows near the opposite bank, the way herons do, like a piece of furniture that happens to be alive. The air smelled of cedar and still water, and the particular mineral dryness that is specific to that part of Texas. I thought about Walter buying this property in 1987. He would have been in his early 40s. The ranch was already established by then. The Hayes Group was growing. He was a man with means and instincts and a long view. He had driven out here, maybe on a day not unlike this one, and he had looked at the unremarkable lake and the modest cabin and the scrubby cedar hills surrounding it, and he had thought about what was underneath all of it. And he had quietly signed his name and paid his money and driven home and said nothing to anyone. He had kept that for 36 years, not because he needed it. He didn't need any individual asset, but because he understood something that I was only beginning to understand standing here at the end of his dock. The most powerful thing you can hold is something that no one else knows you're holding. I looked out at the water for a long time. The heron didn't move. 3 days after the reading, Dorothy called me. Dorothy was Walter's sister, 77 years old, and she had been one of the people in that room who had said least. She had a directness that came from her generation and her Texas upbringing, and probably from being Walter Hayes' sister for 77 years. It was not a family that had ever confused politeness with honesty. "Brandon called me," she said, after about 90 seconds of preliminaries. "I figured he would. He's upset." "I know." "He's saying Walter wasn't of sound mind when he had the codicil drawn up, that the geological survey influenced him inappropriately. I don't entirely understand what he means by that, but Garrett Cole apparently has a theory." She paused. "He's talking about contesting." I sat down on the couch. "Of course he is. I told him that Walter was one of the sharpest men I'd ever known right up until the last 2 months, and that if he tried to stand in a courtroom and say otherwise, he'd better be prepared for me to get up there and say so." Another pause. "I'm telling you because I thought you should know what's coming." "Thank you, Dorothy." "He's not going to win, Evelyn. I want you to know I believe that." "So do I said. And then, because it was Dorothy and honesty was the family language, "I'm scared anyway." A brief silence on the line. "That's the right amount of scared," Dorothy said. "Don't be more than that." I met with David Harmon 2 days later to begin the process of understanding in full what I now owned. He had prepared a summary. 4,700 acres of subsurface rights, in a formation that the geological firm had identified as part of a larger natural gas play that several energy companies had been quietly circling for the better part of 3 years. Walter's holdings sat at the geographic center of the most promising section. The preliminary assessment figure, the one I'd read twice in the conference room, was conservative, as David Harmon had said. A more aggressive valuation, using comparable lease structures in adjacent formations, put the number considerably higher. Considerably. I sat across from David Harmon, and he walked me through the documents and the numbers, and he was careful and clear, and treated me like someone who was capable of understanding complex information, which I appreciated because not everyone had. "What about the Hayes Group holdings?" I asked, at a point where we'd covered the Cutter's Bend documents thoroughly. "The things Brandon inherited." David Harmon looked at me for a moment. Something careful moved through his expression. "That's not really my area to advise you on," he said. "I know, I'm asking generally, as much as you can tell me." He considered. "The Hayes Group companies are profitable, taken individually. The ranch is a well-run operation, but Walter had accumulated some significant long-term liabilities in the commercial portfolio, a development deal from 8 years ago that has not performed as projected, some environmental remediation obligations on a former industrial property, several legal matters that are ongoing." He paused. "Walter was not hiding those things from Brandon. Brandon has been involved in the Hayes Group for years. He knew about the liabilities. He chose to focus on the profitable pieces. So he knew what he was getting." "He knew what he thought he was getting," David Harmon said. "The visible picture was still a very large inheritance. It's only when you set it alongside the Cutter's Bend assessment that the proportions become—" He paused again, searching for the word. "Complicated," I offered. "Instructive," he said. I was in the kitchen making dinner that evening when my phone lit up with Brandon's name. I had been expecting this call in the way you expect certain weather. You know it's coming. You can see it on the horizon. You make what peace you can before it arrives. I picked up. "I want to have an honest conversation," Brandon said. He said it quickly, which meant he'd rehearsed the opening. "I know the last few days have been— there's been a lot to process. For both of us." "All right," I said. "Dad made choices that I don't fully understand, and I'm not going to pretend I'm not—" He stopped. I could hear him deciding how much to show. "I'm angry, Evelyn. I'm not going to lie to you. I think the codicil was— I think something happened there that wasn't in line with who Dad was." "Brandon, let me finish." His voice was tighter now. "I've spent 30 years working in this business. I put real time into the Hayes Group, real work. And Dad knew that. He always said he knew that. And then he turns around and—" The sentence didn't finish cleanly. "I just want to understand what happened." I stood in my kitchen with the phone against my ear, and I thought about 30 years of work that had mostly been aimed at accumulating what the work entitled Brandon to, and about the specific way he had said all right when the lawyer announced I'd received the cabin, the dismissive certainty of a man checking a box. "I think your father understood the situation very clearly," I said. "I think he saw how you operated in it, And I think he made decisions based on what he saw. That's all I know. A long silence. You're saying he was punishing me. I'm saying he was being honest, I said, which is different. Another silence. Longer. I want to buy out the Cutter's Bend rights, Brandon said. His voice had gone flat. The reasonableness had run out. I'll offer you fair market value based on the preliminary assessment. You'd walk away with a clean number, no complications, no legal exposure. But I'm not selling, Brandon. Evelyn, I'm not selling. I'm going to talk to my attorney and take the time I need, and then I'm going to make decisions about the property myself. I paused. That's what Walter left it to me to do. The silence on the other end was different this time. It was the silence of a man recalculating, and I knew, even before he spoke again, that the recalculation was not going to make things easier between us. Think carefully, Brandon said finally, about what comes next. That's all I'm asking. And he hung up. I stood in my kitchen for a moment after the line went dead, looking at the wall, at the particular arrangement of light and shadow in a room I'd lived in for 5 years. Walter had told me once, early in our marriage, that the most dangerous thing Brandon had never learned was the difference between an obstacle and a person. That he had spent so long treating people as things to be managed or moved around that he'd lost the instinct to read them as human beings with their own internal logic. He doesn't know how to read, Walter had said. That's going to matter someday. Standing in the kitchen with Brandon's warning still hanging in the air, I thought, someday was here. And I thought something else too. The thing I hadn't let myself fully think until now, because fully thinking it required acknowledging that whatever came next was going to be harder before it was resolved. Brandon Hayes had just told me to think carefully about what came next, and I had just told him I wasn't going to do what he wanted, which meant the next move was his. Brandon's next move came faster than I expected, and it was uglier than I had prepared for. I found out about it the way you find out about most things you weren't supposed to know, accidentally, through someone who assumed you already did. It was Phil Cafferty's wife, Linda, who mentioned it at the post office parking lot 9 days after the will reading. Linda was not a malicious woman. She was the kind of person who talked freely because it genuinely didn't occur to her that information had weight, that what you passed along could land somewhere and do damage. She saw me loading groceries into my car, and she said, in the bright, chatty tone she used for everything from recipes to disasters, I hope you've got good people around you, Evelyn. I heard Brandon's been talking to the Mabry firm. I stopped with a bag halfway into the trunk. The Mabry firm. The litigation group out of Dallas. Gerald Mabry, Deb. He does estate challenges. Phil mentioned it, and I probably shouldn't have said anything. I just assumed you'd... She read something in my face and stopped. You didn't know. It's fine, Linda, I said. Thank you. I drove home with my hands steady on the wheel and my mind moving fast and quiet, the way it does when something you expected arrives and is still worse than you thought. Gerald Mabry. I knew the name. Walter had mentioned it once, years ago, in the context of a business dispute that had gotten complicated. He'd said Mabry was the kind of attorney you hired when you didn't want a resolution. You wanted a war of attrition. The kind who billed by the hour and understood that the most effective legal strategy was sometimes simply making the process expensive enough that the other side ran out of endurance before they ran out of rights. I called David Harmon's office before I'd finished unloading the car. David Harmon was not surprised. That in itself was informative. We anticipated this was a possibility, he said, in the measured way of a man who had known and judged. It wasn't yet the moment to say so. The codicil is sound, Evelyn. The mineral rights filing is airtight. It's been on public record for 36 years, renewed consistently. There's no procedural gap for them to exploit. What they'll likely argue is testamentary capacity. That Walter wasn't of sound mind, or that he was unduly influenced. It's the standard play when the document is clean and the argument has to come from somewhere. Unduly influenced. I sat with that phrase for a moment. The implication being that I had somehow engineered a dying man into changing his will in my favor, that 5 years of ordinary marriage, of driving to appointments and making coffee and sitting on the back porch, had been a calculated manipulation rather than a life. Can they win? I asked. A pause. Not long, but real. If they find the right expert witnesses and the right judge, they can make things difficult. Walter's medical records from the last 18 months will be central. How he presented cognitively, whether there are any documented concerns. Another pause. Do you know of any? None, I said. His body was failing. His mind wasn't. That's consistent with what I observed, David Harmon said. I met with Walter 4 times in the 18 months before his death. The codicil meeting was the last. He was thorough, he was specific, and he asked better questions than most of my clients 40 years younger. A beat. We'll be fine, Evelyn. But I want you to be prepared for this to take time. Time. Mabry's specialty, apparently. What followed was 6 weeks that I can only describe as a kind of organized unpleasantness. Not dramatic. There was no single confrontation, no defining moment. It was more like weather, persistent, gray, wearing. Brennan filed a formal notice of intent to contest. Garrett Cole signed the filing. Gerald Mabry's firm was listed as co-counsel. The grounds, as David Harmon had predicted, were testamentary capacity and undue influence. The filing included language about Walter's declining health in the final months of his life, his reliance on prescription medications, the significant influence exerted by a spousal party and decisions made during a period of physical vulnerability. A spousal party. That was me. Translated from legal language, Brandon was arguing that I had manipulated a sick old man. I read that filing sitting at Walter's desk in the study, in the chair he'd sat in for 30 years. And I felt something I hadn't expected. Not just anger, not just hurt, but a very specific variety of exhausted fury that comes from having your most ordinary, unperformed self described as a scheme. Every cup of coffee, every drive to the hospital, every evening on the back porch, reframed as calculation, reframed as performance. I called Dorothy. I saw it, she said, before I got through the first sentence. Garrett Cole called Frank to give him a heads up, which tells you how confident they are. They were expecting me to be bothered enough to call you and tell you to settle. A short, dry sound that was Dorothy's version of a laugh. I called you to tell you to do the opposite. I'm not settling. Good. Because I've already contacted David Harmon and told him I'll testify to Walter's mental state. I was with him 6 times in the last year of his life, including twice in the month before he died. The man was tired and he was thin and he knew he was running out of time, but he was clear, Evelyn. He was the clearest he'd ever been. That's what happens sometimes at the end. Things get very simple. I pressed my hand against the desk. Walter's desk. The wood was worn smooth in front of the chair where his forearms had rested for decades. Dorothy, I said, does it bother you? What he left to who? A long pause. Honest pause. Dorothy never answered quickly unless she'd already thought about it. Walter loved Brandon, she said finally, in the complicated way you love someone who has disappointed you consistently but is still yours. He left him a great deal, Evelyn. A very great deal. Another pause. What bothers me is that Brandon can't see that. What he got was real. He just can't stop looking at what you got long enough to understand what he has. The deposition was scheduled for a Thursday morning in April. Gerald Mabry's office was on the 14th floor of a Dallas high-rise, the kind of space designed to communicate that the people who occupied it were expensive and knew it. Heavy furniture, real art, the specific silence of thick carpet and good insulation. I sat across from Gerald Mabry himself, a man in his early 60s with the patient, predatory stillness of someone who has spent decades in rooms exactly like this one. My attorney, a woman named Susan Floor, whom David Harmon had recommended, and who had arrived at our first meeting with an accordion folder in a manner that I found immediately reassuring, not because she was warm but because she was precise, sat beside me. Mabry began with the expected questions. How long had I known Walter before we married? How we had met? The nature of my involvement in his medical care during the last year of his life, whether I had accompanied him to doctor's appointments, whether I had been present for conversations with his physicians, whether I had ever discussed his estate plans with him. I answered clearly and without embellishment because Susan had told me to answer clearly and without embellishment. Don't explain, she had said. Answer what's asked, nothing more. Then Mabry shifted. Mrs. Hayes, he said, setting down his pen in the deliberate way of a man signaling a change of direction. Were you aware, prior to the reading of the primary will, that Walter had executed a codicil. No. You had no knowledge of the mineral rights attached to the Cutter's Bend property? Not until David Harmon read the codicil in the conference room. And you had no knowledge of the geological survey Walter commissioned? No. He looked at me steadily. You were his wife. You lived in the same house. You were present for many of his decisions. You're asking me to believe that Walter Hayes commissioned a geological survey of a property he then left to you and discussed none of this with you? Walter didn't discuss every business decision with me, I said. He discussed things he wanted to discuss. He kept things he wanted to keep private. I paused. That was consistent with who he was. Ask anyone who worked with him. You described your relationship as close. It was close. Close people don't always tell each other everything. That's not a contradiction. Mowbray's expression didn't change much. He had heard everything in these rooms and been moved by very little. Did Walter ever express to you any dissatisfaction with his son? Susan put a hand briefly on my arm. A small professional signal. I understood it. Be careful here. Walter had a complicated relationship with Brandon, I said. He loved him. He was sometimes disappointed by him. That's not unusual between fathers and sons. Did he ever discuss changing his estate plans because of that disappointment? Not specifically. Did he ever suggest that he intended to favor you over Brandon in any future disposition? No, not in those words. Mabry picked up his pen again. Not in those words, he repeated, writing something. Is there another version of that statement, Mrs. Hayes? I looked at him. He was good. I'll give him that. He was patient and precise, and he had found the small hinge in my answer and was applying pressure to it with exactly the right amount of force. He told me he knew what he was doing, I said. Toward the end, when I raised concerns about Brandon's involvement in his business decisions, he said, I know what I'm doing, Evelyn. That's the entirety of what he said about it. And you interpreted that as... I interpreted it as Walter telling me he had a plan and I should trust him, I said, which is what it turned out to be, Shishad. I was in the parking garage after the deposition, sitting in my car with the engine off, when Susan knocked on the window. I hadn't realized I was just sitting there. I rolled the window down. You did well, she said. Did I? Better than well. You were consistent, you were specific, and you didn't oversell. Mabry was looking for inconsistencies or emotion he could use, and you didn't give him either. She tilted her head slightly. Are you all right? I'm tired, I said. And then, I'm angry. In that order. She nodded like those were both reasonable positions. The anger is useful. Don't let it go before this is over. She straightened up. I'll be in touch by end of week with next steps. She walked away and I sat in the parking garage, and I let myself be angry for a few minutes without managing it. There's a particular indignity in being required to defend the authenticity of your own love. To sit in a leather chair in an expensive office and answer questions designed to imply that the most ordinary parts of your life, the coffee, the drives, the evenings on the porch, were theater. Calculated. Stage managed for financial benefit. Walter had known this was coming. He must have known, because he knew Brandon and he knew Mabry's type, and he had still chosen to do it this way. He had still sealed the envelope, still arranged the sequencing, still written down everything he saw. I thought he trusted me to hold the line, and then I started the car and drove back to Denton. The thing that broke the stalemate, and I use that word carefully because it wasn't a sudden break, it was more like a wall developing cracks, was something that had nothing to do with me. It was the Hayes Group auditors. In the weeks following the estate contest filing, Brandon had begun the process of formally taking control of the Hayes Group companies. Asset transfers, management transitions, the bureaucratic machinery of inheritance. And in that process, the existing audit firm, which had a long-standing relationship with the Hayes Group going back to Walter's active management, produced a current financial assessment of the portfolio. I heard about this from an unexpected source, one of Walter's longtime employees, a man named Carl Briggs, who had managed the ranch operations for 11 years, and who called me, hesitantly, on a Tuesday afternoon because he didn't know who else to tell. I probably shouldn't be calling you, Carl said. He sounded like a man who had spent several days deciding whether to make this call. It's all right, Carl. The audit numbers, he said. Brandon's people are, They're trying to keep it quiet, but the ranch staff knows because some of it affects our operating budget directly. The development portfolio is, Mrs. Hayes, it's worse than anyone outside the company understood. That Corpus Christi deal from a few years back, the one Brandon pushed hard on, it's got ongoing liabilities that aren't fully disclosed in the public records. And there's an environmental issue on the old Millard industrial property that's going to require remediation that he stopped. I guess what I'm saying is, what Brandon inherited isn't what Brandon thought he inherited. How bad? I said. A pause. The numbers I've seen suggest that after the liabilities are accounted for, the real value of the commercial portfolio is maybe 40% of the nominal figure. He hesitated. Maybe less. I sat very still. Carl, does Brandon know this? His finance people know, whether they've told him directly or whether they're still... Another pause. I don't know exactly what he knows, but I know he's been making noise about selling certain assets quickly, which is either a coincidence or it's not. Well, I called David Harmon that evening and repeated everything Carl had told me. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a silence that I had learned to recognize as his thinking silence, distinct from his speaking pause. This is consistent with what I suggested at our first meeting, he said carefully. The Hayes Group liabilities were a known quantity, but their full scope may not have been visible without a complete audit. Walter would have known the picture in full. Brandon may have understood the broad strokes, but not the detail. Walter left him a burden, I said. Not a question. Walter left him what he'd earned, David Harmon said. And then, as if recognizing that was closer to an editorial than he typically allowed himself. The estate is what it is. What matters now is that you understand your position relative to his. Which is? Even in the most conservative valuation scenario, the Cutter's Bend asset substantially exceeds the net value of the Hayes Group commercial portfolio once liabilities are properly accounted for. If Brandon's advisors have run those numbers honestly, they know it too. A beat. Which may explain why the contest filing has been slower to progress than Mabry typically operates. I thought about that. He's recalculating. I think everyone involved is recalculating. Brandon called me a week after that conversation. It was 9 in the evening, and I was reading, and his name on the screen felt different this time. Less like incoming weather, and more like a man who had walked outside and discovered the weather had already changed on him. I know about the audit, he said. No preamble. Carl Briggs called me, I said. I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Of course he did. Not angry. Deflated. I had never heard Brandon Hayes sound deflated before. It was somehow more unsettling than the anger. The Corpus Christi numbers they're not good. Garrett knew it was complicated, but the full scope of it... He stopped. I waited. Dad knew, Brandon said. He knew exactly what that deal looked like on the inside. Yes. He left it to me anyway. He left you the empire you always wanted, I said. He left you the visible things, the name and the status and the company. He just didn't clean it up for you first. A long silence. That's a hell of a thing to do, Brandon said quietly. Brandon! I put the book down. What Walter left you is still real. There's still a working ranch that 11 people depend on for their livelihoods. There are still functional businesses in that portfolio. The liabilities are serious, but they're manageable if you approach them honestly instead of trying to flip assets before anyone notices. I paused. Walter ran that business through things that were harder than this. I'm not Dad. I know that, I said. But you have what he built. What you do with it is yours. Another silence. When he spoke again, his voice was lower and had lost the controlled quality that Brandon Hayes almost never dropped. Why are you telling me this? Why are you... You could just let me... Because your father loved you, I said. Even at the end, even after everything, that was real. And I'm not interested in watching his legacy fall apart because you and I couldn't find a way to be in the same room without it becoming a war. I heard something on the other end of the line that I couldn't identify. A breath, maybe. Or something closer to the sound a man makes when something he's been braced against suddenly isn't there anymore and he's not sure what to do with his own weight. The contest filing, he said after a moment. Your call. Another silence, the longest one yet. I'll talk to Garrett, he said. And then, the board on the dock at Cutter's Bend needs replacing. It took me a moment to understand what he was doing. Offering something ordinary, offering to acknowledge that the place was real and mine and needed tending, which was, from Brandon Hayes, a kind of concession I hadn't expected. I know, I said. I'm going to fix it. He hung up without saying goodbye, which was very Brandon, and I sat in the reading chair for a while after, in the quiet of a house that was mine and would remain mine, holding the particular complicated feeling of a situation that was not over but had shifted, had moved from one kind of terrible to a different, less certain shape. Walter had said, "I know what I'm doing, Evelyn." He had arranged everything down to the sequence. The primary will first, so everyone heard it. The sealed envelope second, so the revelation had maximum clarity. The codicil in Walter's own voice, so that no one could misunderstand the intention. But what he had also arranged, what I was only now beginning to understand, was that the real document wasn't the one in the envelope. The real document was the situation itself, the architecture of consequence he had constructed, quietly, over years. The visible empire weighted with hidden debt, the modest cabin sitting above a fortune, the son who chased surfaces and the wife who had never asked about them. Walter had not done this to punish Brandon. I believed that now in a way I hadn't been fully certain of before. He had done it because he believed, even at the end, that the weight of the right consequences might teach what decades of softer lessons had failed to. Whether he was right about that was still an open question. But the weight was there. And it was doing what weight does. Garrett Cole withdrew the contest filing on a Wednesday morning in early May. David Harmon called me before 9 to tell me. He used the word withdrawn in the careful, neutral way of a man who has seen enough of these situations to know that the correct response is not celebration. Mabry's office filed the withdrawal late yesterday afternoon, he said. No statement, no conditions, just a clean withdrawal. Why? I asked. Though I thought I already knew. My read is that once the full audit picture came into focus, the math changed. Contesting the codicil was viable as long as the Hayes Group holdings looked substantial enough to justify the fight. Once the real liability exposure became clear, he paused. Spending another 18 months in litigation to potentially recover an asset that's worth considerably more than everything Brandon actually has, cleanly, after debts. That calculation becomes very difficult to make. So he withdrew because he couldn't afford to win. A beat. That's one way to put it. I stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the yard, at the live oak Walter had planted the first spring we were married. It was leafing out now, the new growth, that particular bright green it only gets in May. What happens next? I said. You decide what to do with what you have, David Harmon said. That's the entirety of what comes next. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that, because I think there's an expectation, when someone who has been wronged is finally in the stronger position, that the wronged person feels vindicated, maybe even a little righteous, a sense of the scales righting themselves. What I felt was tired. A particular deep tired that had been building since the morning I got the call at 6:14 and drove to the hospice facility and sat with a man whose hand was still warm and had not really let up in the 2 months since. The contest filing had added a specific kind of exhaustion on top of the grief. The kind that comes from having to defend yourself in rooms where the defense itself is a form of humiliation. Now the filing was gone and I was still tired. And I missed Walter in the specific daily way of someone whose ordinary routines have been organized around another person for years and suddenly aren't. I missed him making coffee. He made it too strong and he knew it, and he made it that way anyway. I missed the particular quality of silence in the house when he was in his study working. A present silence. Not an absent silence. I missed the way he'd look at me sometimes across a room full of people with an expression that said, plainly, I see you in here and everything is fine. The withdrawal of the legal challenge gave me back the energy I'd been spending on bracing against it, and I didn't know right away what to do with that energy. So I went to Cutter's Bend. Utsit. I had been going to the lake regularly since the will reading, not for any practical purpose in those early weeks. Just to be there, to stand on the dock and look at the water and think. It had become a habit the way certain places become habits, the way you return to them when you need to locate yourself. I had also been meeting, in the previous 3 weeks, with a woman named Patricia Okafor, who ran a consulting firm specializing in natural resource negotiations. Susan Flore had recommended her, describing her as the best in the state at negotiating lease terms for mineral rights situations like mine. Patricia was 44, calm in the specific way of someone who regularly deals with energy companies and has learned to regard their initial offers as opening theater. She was not warm, exactly, but she was direct, and I had come to find directness more comforting than warmth in this period of my life. 3 companies have made formal expressions of interest, Patricia had told me at our last meeting. One you've already heard from, the Midland firm that called you the day after the reading. 2 others have reached out to my office. There's a 4th that hasn't made contact yet, but that I expect to. They've been the most active in the region, and they'll want a position in this formation. What are we actually looking at? I asked. Not the preliminary assessment. What do you think the real picture is? She had looked at me steadily. Conservative scenario, factoring realistic extraction costs and current market prices for natural gas. You're looking at a lease value, not sale, lease, that will generate significant annual royalty income for the duration of production, which, based on the geological assessment, is likely to be a very long duration. She paused. Aggressive scenario, which I believe is the more accurate one based on comparable formations, you're looking at something considerably higher. She gave me a number. I had made peace with the number from the preliminary assessment. This number required a different conversation with myself. What's the catch? I said. There's always pressure in these negotiations to move quickly. Energy companies want to lock in terms before the market shifts or before competing interests develop. They'll make initial offers that seem substantial and that are structured to look final. She set down her pen. They're not final. Nothing is final until I tell you it is. How long do we wait them out? As long as it takes, she said simply. You're not in debt. You're not in a hurry. Time is on your side. That is genuinely rare in this industry, and we should use it. What I had not anticipated, what I don't think anyone had anticipated, was what happened with Brandon in the weeks after the withdrawal. The calls didn't stop, but they changed. The first change was small. He called one afternoon and started with the same controlled, reasonable voice, and then, partway through a sentence about access easements near the lake, he stopped himself and said, "This isn't what I actually called about." I waited. "The Corpus Christi remediation," he said. "The estimate came in. It's worse than the second estimate, and considerably worse than the first." A pause. "I need to make some decisions about the commercial portfolio, and I wanted to ask what Dad used to do when he was looking at a situation where every option was bad. I did not say what I thought, which was, he asked people who had earned his trust, which was a category you mostly removed yourself from. What I said was, he used to make a list of what he was actually trying to protect and start from there. Not what he was trying to keep, what he was trying to protect." Silence. "The ranch," Brandon said after a moment. "The actual working ranch. Carl's job. The other employees. Then you start from there." Another pause. "I might need to sell some of the commercial holdings to cover the remediation costs." "Then sell them." "They were part of what Dad built." "Brandon." I sat down. I was in Walter's study, in Walter's chair. "The ranch is what Walter built. Everything else was what came from it. They're not the same thing." A long silence. When he spoke again, his voice had something in it I'd rarely heard from him. Something that wasn't calculation and wasn't performance. Just a person trying to find a foothold. He knew this was going to happen, didn't he? The audit, the remediation. He knew I was going to be standing here with this. I think he knew there was a real possibility. And he left it to me anyway. "He left you what he thought you needed," I said, "not what you wanted." I heard him exhale. A long, controlled breath of someone who has been holding something and is deciding whether to put it down. That's a hard thing to hear. I know it is. The conversation I hadn't expected to have came 11 days after that one, and it came not from Brandon, but from Connie. Connie Hayes called me on a Saturday morning. This was so outside the established pattern of our relationship that I checked the name on the screen twice before answering. "I want to talk to you," she said. "Without Brandon. Can we meet?" We met at a diner in Denton, The kind that has been in business since before either of us was born and seems to operate on a different timeline than the rest of the world. The same booths, the same coffee, the same unhurried atmosphere regardless of what is happening outside its windows. Connie was dressed the way she always dressed, composed, deliberate, every detail attended to. But she looked tired in a way that her composure couldn't quite cover. She had shadows under her eyes, and she held her coffee cup with both hands like she needed the warmth of it. "I'm going to say something that I should probably have said years ago," she began, "and I want to say it before I change my mind. All right, I wasn't kind to you. When you married Walter, I wasn't kind, and I let Brandon take a lead from me when maybe—" She stopped, started again. "I told myself that you had married an old man for his money and that everything you did was performance. And I told myself that because it was a convenient story. It made you into something I didn't have to feel badly about treating the way we treated you." She looked at her coffee cup. "But I watched you at that hospice. I was there the second day. I don't know if you remember. I came late in the afternoon, and you were in the room with him, and you didn't know I was in the corridor, and you were just talking to him, quietly. There was nothing in it. It was just you talking to him." She paused. "It wasn't performance." I looked at her for a moment. This was not a woman who apologized easily. The effort of it was visible, and I wasn't going to minimize that. "I remember you were there," I said. "You brought Dorothy coffee." She blinked, like she hadn't expected me to remember that specific detail. "Yes." "Thank you for saying this, Connie. I'm not asking you to forget it," she said quickly. "What we did. The family photograph, the things Brandon said. I'm not asking you to pretend that didn't happen. I just wanted you to know that I know it happened, and that I know it was wrong." I nodded. I didn't tell her it was fine because it hadn't been fine, and she deserved an honest response more than she deserved a comfortable one. "I appreciate that," I said. "Genuinely." She wrapped her hands tighter around the cup. "Brandon is struggling, with the business, with all of it. I don't think he knows how to ask for help without it feeling like losing." "I know," I said. "He's not a bad person," she said. "He's a person who learned the wrong things about what mattered and spent 30 years getting very good at the wrong things." She met my eyes. "I'm not asking you to forgive him either. I thought you should know that he's genuinely trying to figure out who he is without the inheritance being everything he thought it was." I thought about Brandon on the phone saying, "I'm not dad," with the flatness of someone stating a fact they'd only recently understood was not a complaint, but an accounting of genuine distance. I thought about Walter's letter. He always chased status and power, not written with contempt, written with the sad, clear-eyed precision of a father who had seen his son's flaw early and had spent decades hoping the boy would outgrow it, and had finally, at the end, accepted that love doesn't cure what only consequences can reach. "Tell him to call Carl Briggs," I said. "Carl knows the ranch operation better than anyone alive. And Carl was loyal to Walter because Walter listened to him. Brandon should listen to him too." Connie looked at me for a moment like she was reading something. "Okay," she said. "And tell him the contest withdrawal was the right call. Whatever else happens, that was the right call. Walter would have thought so too." The meeting with the energy companies began in June. Patricia Okafor ran it with the efficiency of someone who has prepared extensively and knows it, and I sat beside her at a conference table in a downtown Austin hotel meeting room while representatives from 4 companies made their cases in sequence. It was strange and not entirely comfortable, being the person in the room that everyone was oriented toward. I had spent most of my adult life in rooms where that was not the case, where I was either invisible or peripheral, and the adjustment required a kind of internal recalibration that I was still in the process of making. The first company's representative was young and fast-talking and led with a number that he presented as extraordinary. Patricia thanked him warmly and made a small note. The second company sent someone older who led with relationships. A long history of partnership in the region, community investment, the importance of working with landowners rather than simply extracting from them. It was a more sophisticated pitch, and I paid closer attention to it. The third company was the Midland firm that had called me the day after the will reading. Their representative recognized me and had the brief, controlled awkwardness of someone who knows their opening move had not made a good first impression. Their offer was the highest of the first 3. The fourth company arrived last. Their representative was a woman named Grace Tanner, who was perhaps 60, with the direct, unhurried manner of someone who has been in enough negotiations to know that the performance of urgency belongs to the side that needs the deal more. She presented their proposal without theater. The terms were structured differently from the others: a higher initial royalty rate in exchange for a longer commitment period, with specific provisions protecting surface rights and requiring environmental remediation bonds. After the presentations, Patricia excused everyone and turned to me. "Well," she said. "The fourth company," I said. "I thought so too, but we're going to let them sweat for 2 weeks first." She wrote something on her pad. "And then we're going to negotiate the royalty rate up another 4% because we can." "Can we?" "She flew here from Houston, knowing our next best offer," Patricia said. "She wants this. We've got room." I drove back from Austin in the late afternoon through the rolling hill country where the highway runs long and straight and the sky is that particular shade of blue that only happens in Texas in early summer, deep and clean and enormous. I drove with the window down because Walter had always said air conditioning was for people who were afraid of where they were, and I had picked up the habit without intending to. I thought about the meeting and about Patricia's controlled competence and about what it meant to have, for the first time in my adult life, something of this magnitude that was entirely and unambiguously mine, not inherited alongside someone else, not shared. Mine, left to me by a man who had seen me clearly and had made a decision about what I deserved and had arranged the world accordingly. The weight of that was something I was still learning to carry. Not the money. I was less sure about the money than people assumed, less certain about what I wanted to do with it and what I didn't. What I was learning to carry was the being seen, the fact of having been known that fully by someone who asked for nothing in return for the knowing. I stopped at a gas station on the edge of Denton, and while the tank filled, I looked at my phone. There was a message from Brandon, sent that afternoon while I was in the meeting. I had turned my phone to silent and hadn't seen it come in. "Carl took me out on the south pasture this morning. First time I've been out there in maybe 8 years. Different than I remembered. Wanted you to know." I read it twice. It was such a small thing. It was enormous. I put the phone in my pocket and finished filling the tank and got back in the car. The live oak in the front yard was visible from the end of the driveway as I pulled in, fully leafed out now, casting a shadow that reached across the porch the way it had for decades before I arrived, and would continue to for decades after everything I was in the middle of had resolved into history. Walter had planted that tree knowing he probably wouldn't live to sit in its full shade. That was the kind of man he was. He thought in long enough terms to plant things he wouldn't benefit from, because the planting mattered even when the harvest wasn't his. I sat in the driveway and I thought about what I was going to do with what he had given me, not just the asset and the royalty income and the negotiating position and all the practical architecture of a life suddenly restructured, but the permission. The statement, made in ink and read aloud in a room full of people who had underestimated me. That someone had seen who I was and had found it worth protecting. I didn't have all the answers yet about what I was going to do with that, but I was going to do something worthy of it. That much I knew. The more I thought about it, sitting in the driveway in the last of the afternoon light, the more I understood that Walter's plan had never really been about me and Brandon at all. It had been about something larger. What gets left behind and who you are to the people you leave it to. Not what they're owed. Not what they've earned in the simple arithmetic of time served. But who they have been, in the private moments when no one was watching and nothing was being asked. Walter had been watching, and he had made his accounting. And the thing that still undid me, quietly, when I let myself think about it, the thing I was still not entirely sure how to live with, was that he had found me worth protecting before I had fully understood that I was. The lease agreement with Grace Tanner's company was signed on a Thursday morning in late July in Patricia Okafor's office, with the particular undramatic finality that major things sometimes have: a pen moving across paper, a handshake, coffee that nobody touched because everyone was too focused to remember it was there. Patricia had gotten the additional 4% on the royalty rate. She had also negotiated a surface protection clause that restricted any extraction activity within a half-mile of the cabin and dock, an environmental bond requirement that exceeded the state minimum by a considerable margin, and a community investment provision that required the company to contribute to local infrastructure in the surrounding county for the duration of the production period. Grace Tanner had accepted all of it. Not without resistance. There had been 2 weeks of back and forth that Patricia navigated with the patience of someone who genuinely enjoys this particular kind of chess. But she had accepted it, because the asset was worth it, and everyone in the room knew the asset was worth it. When it was done, Patricia walked me to the elevator and said, "Walter Hayes picked the right person to leave this to." I looked at her. "Why do you say that?" "Because you didn't rush," she said. "Every person I've worked with who came into something like this, the first instinct is to move fast, to lock it in before it disappears, as if the ground might open up and take it back. You didn't do that. You waited and you listened and you let the process work." She pressed the elevator button. That's rarer than the asset. I thought about that on the drive home, about waiting, about the particular discipline of trusting that something is real even when you can't yet see its full shape. I fixed the dock board at Cutter's Bend myself. This is a small thing, and I include it because it mattered to me in a way that was disproportionate to its size. I drove out on a Saturday morning in August with a new plank I'd bought at the hardware store and a drill and a box of exterior screws, and I replaced the board that had been slightly raised at one end since the first time I'd visited. It took me 40 minutes, and I did it badly the first time and had to redo one of the screws. And when I was done, the new board was a slightly different color than the rest of the dock, and would be for a year or two until the weather evened it out. I stood on the repaired dock and looked at the lake, and I felt something settle in me that I hadn't been able to name since March. This was mine. Not as an abstraction, not as a number on a document, not as a position in a legal dispute. This particular dock, this particular lake, this particular landscape of cedar and still water and the sound of a heron moving somewhere in the reeds at the far bank. Walter had left me this specific place, not just the value underneath it, and I understood now what he had understood when he drove out here in 1987 and quietly signed his name, that some things matter because of what they hold inside, and the surface is just where you stand while you figure that out. The heron was there again, same position as before, or close enough, motionless in the shallows near the opposite bank, arranged in the patient posture of a creature that understands the value of stillness. "All right, Walter," I said, to the lake and the bird and the wide Texas sky. "I hear you." "What?" Carl Briggs called me in September with news I hadn't entirely expected. Brandon had made a decision about the commercial portfolio. He had sold 3 of the underperforming development assets at a loss. A painful loss. The kind that required swallowing the pride of a man who had been certain he knew what those assets were worth, and had used the proceeds to fully fund the Corpus Christi environmental remediation, clear the most pressing liability from the portfolio, and establish an operating reserve for the ranch that would carry it through 2 full years, regardless of cattle prices. He sat with the ranch accountant for 3 days straight, Carl told me. I've never seen him do that. Usually he flies in, makes a decision, flies out. This time he stayed. Brought Connie. They ate dinner with the staff on the second night. "How did it go?" "Awkward," Carl said honestly. "These are people who've worked here for years and Brandon barely knows their names. It was awkward." A pause. "But he stayed anyway. That's the part I keep thinking about. He could have left and nobody would have said anything, and he stayed." I thought about Connie in the diner, both hands around her coffee cup, saying, "He's genuinely trying to figure out who he is." I thought about Brandon's text message, first time I've been out there in maybe 8 years, and the particular smallness of it, the way it was offered without framing or context, just a fact presented quietly, the closest thing to an apology that Brandon Hayes was probably capable of at that point in his life. People change in the only way people actually change. Slowly, imperfectly, without announcement, through the accumulation of small choices that individually seem insufficient and collectively become something different than what existed before. Walter had known that. He had built the entire architecture of this inheritance around that understanding. The hardest conversation happened in October, and I had been the one who initiated it. I called Brandon and asked if he would meet me at Cutter's Bend. There was a silence on the phone that I could not read. Then, "Why?" "Because I want to show you something," I said. "And because I think it's time." He came on a Tuesday afternoon. He drove himself, which was unusual. Brandon typically traveled with purpose and efficiency, and other people doing the logistics. He parked on the gravel and walked down toward the dock where I was standing, and he looked different than he had at the will reading. Thinner, maybe. Less groomed in the particular way that means a person has stopped performing their appearance quite as relentlessly. He looked like someone who had been working. We stood on the dock side by side and looked at the lake. The new board was weathering in. You could still see the difference in color if you were looking for it. I had the board fixed, I said. I see that. A pause. Brandon, I said, I want to tell you something, and I want you to actually hear it, which I know is a thing I'm asking you to do on purpose. Your father loved this place, not for what's under it. I don't think he thought about that very often, once he'd secured the rights. He loved it because it was quiet and it didn't ask anything of him. He used to come out here when things were difficult and just sit. I paused. He told me that the first year we were married. He said there were 3 places in the world where he could think clearly, and this was one of them. Brandon looked at the water. His jaw moved slightly. I'm not telling you this to make you feel something about the inheritance, I said. I'm telling you because I think you should know that the thing your father left me wasn't really the mineral rights. The mineral rights were, I paused, searching for it. They were his way of protecting me, of making sure that when he was gone, I'd be all right regardless of what happened. But this, I gestured at the lake, the dock, the surrounding hills. This is what he left me because he thought I'd understand it. The quiet, the not asking. Brandon was very still. He knew you'd fight it, I said. He knew the contest filing was coming. He planned for it. David Harmon was prepared. The filing history was unassailable. He arranged everything so that if you fought it, you'd lose cleanly and we'd both still be standing at the end. I turned to look at him. He wasn't trying to hurt you, Brandon. He was trying to make you stand somewhere you hadn't stood before and see what was visible from there. Brandon looked at me for a long moment. His eyes were his father's color, that specific gray-green I'd never found a good word for. And they had something in them that I had never seen there before. Not softness exactly. More like the look of a person who has taken a wrong road for a very long time and has just come around a bend and recognized where they actually are. I called him a fool, Brandon said quietly. 3 years before he died. We had an argument about a business decision he'd made, one that turned out to be correct. But I didn't know that yet. And I called him a fool. I said he'd lost his edge, that he was getting old and sentimental and making decisions based on feelings instead of data. He paused. He just looked at me, didn't say anything. And I was angry enough that I didn't apologize, and then time passed, and I kept not apologizing, and then he got sick. He stopped. I never told him I was wrong. The lake was very still, not even the heron today. Just the flat gray-green water reflecting the October sky. He knew, I said. You don't know that. Walter knew everything, I said. That was his particular burden. He knew, and he waited, and he hoped people would figure it out themselves. I paused. He wrote about you in the codicil as someone who always chased status and power. That's not how you write about someone you've given up on. That's how you write about someone you still understand. Brandon turned away from me and looked out at the water. I let him. Some things need to be looked at sideways. After a while, he said, What are you going to do with it? The royalty income? I've been thinking about that, I said. I had been thinking about it since the lease was signed, and the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. Not all at once, but in the way that the right decision clarifies, gradually, the way the lake surface settles after you've thrown something into it. Walter had told me once that the difference between wealth and money was what you did when you had more than you needed. Money was what you held. Wealth was what you built with what you held. He said most people never made the distinction, and that was the real shortage in the world. Not of resources, but of the willingness to think past your own immediate edges. I had established, in consultation with David Harmon and a financial advisor Patricia Okafor had recommended, a foundation. The Walter T. Hayes Foundation, named not for my benefit but for the most accurate reason. It was funded by what Walter had hidden and was going to do what Walter had always quietly done, which was invest in things whose value wasn't immediately obvious. The foundation's primary focus was twofold. The first was the county hospital, the same hospital where I had first met Walter at that charity auction, the same institution his will had included a modest bequest to. I was expanding that bequest considerably. The hospital's rural outreach program, which served farming communities 2 and 3 counties out, had been running on a budget that required it to make choices no medical program should have to make. It was no longer going to have to make those choices. The second focus was something more personal, a scholarship program for women returning to education or professional development after a period of caregiving, for elderly parents, for sick spouses, for children, for any of the 100 invisible reasons women step out of their own forward motion and then find when the caregiving ends that the world has moved and they've been left standing still. I knew that particular geography. I had lived in it. I told Brandon about the foundation on the dock that afternoon. He listened without interrupting, which was not something Brandon Hayes typically did, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment. He would have liked that, he said. The hospital piece especially. He always gave to the hospital. I know. The women's scholarship. He paused. That's you. That's a lot of people, I said. I just happen to know what the territory looks like from the inside. Another pause. Then, I want to contribute to the foundation. He said it quickly, the way he said things he'd decided to say before he could talk himself out of them. The ranch has a charitable giving program. It's been dormant for a few years. I let it lapse, but I want to reinstate it and direct part of it to the foundation, if you'll accept it. I looked at him. It's not... He stopped, started again. It's not about the money. I'm not trying to buy anything. I know, I said. I just think he built all of it. The ranch, the businesses, the rights under this lake. He built all of it. I don't think it should only come from your side. I thought about Walter, who had loved his son in the complicated way you love someone who has disappointed you consistently but is still yours, who had left him a real inheritance weighted with real consequences and had trusted that the weight might do what 30 years of comfort hadn't, who had written about Brandon with the unsentimental clarity of a man telling the truth about his own family because he respected everyone involved too much to soften it. All right, I said. Brandon nodded once. He looked at the water for another moment, and then he looked at the new board in the dock, and something crossed his face that I didn't try to name. You did it wrong, he said. I know, I said. One of the screws is off angle. I could fix it. It'll weather in, I said. It's fine how it is. He looked at me. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Something shorter and less certain than that, but real. More real, probably, than most of what I'd seen on his face across all the years of dinners and meetings and family photographs where I'd been stood outside the frame. All right, he said. I am writing this from the porch of the cabin at Cutter's Bend, which I have been restoring slowly and carefully over the past several months. Not renovating, restoring. There is a difference. Renovation replaces things. Restoration brings things back to what they were when they were right. The dock is fully sound. The off-angle screw is exactly where I left it. It is early November and the lake is the color of pewter, and the cedar hills have gone their particular autumn shade. That mix of gray-green and russet that doesn't look like much in photographs, but in person is the most specific beauty I know. The heron comes most mornings. I've stopped being surprised by it. The foundation made its first grants 3 months ago. The hospital program director called me after to say that what we had committed would allow them to reinstate a mobile clinic route that had been suspended for 2 years due to funding. She said it in the practical way of someone who deals with practical problems. But toward the end of the call, her voice changed just slightly, and she said, "People have been waiting for that clinic. People who had nowhere else to go." I said I was glad. She said, "Your husband used to donate to us every year. We miss him." I said, "I know." She said, "He would have been glad about this." I said, "I know that too." I said, The first scholarship recipients were announced last month. 12 women. I read every application. Patricia Okafor told me I didn't have to. That the selection committee was capable, and she was right, but I wanted to. I wanted to know who they were. I wanted to understand, specifically and individually, what the scholarship was going to change. One of them was a woman who had spent 9 years as the primary caregiver for her mother-in-law and had put aside a nursing degree she'd been 2 semesters from finishing. She was going back to complete it. She was 53 years old. In her application, she wrote, "I know it seems late. I don't think it's late." I read that sentence 3 times. Then I wrote it on a piece of paper and put it on the desk in the cabin. I don't think it's late. Tits, Walter had a saying. Not a motto. He would have hated the word motto. Just something he said occasionally, usually in contexts where a decision had to be made with incomplete information. He said, "You plant what you can tend, and you tend what you planted, and everything else is just weather." I have thought about that a lot this year, about what it means to plant something and what it means to tend it, and where the line is between investment and attachment, between caring for something and depending on it, between love that asks nothing and love that asks everything. I think about the 5 years of our marriage and the things I did and the things I didn't do. I drove him to appointments. I made coffee too weak by his standards and too strong by mine, and we split the difference somewhere in the middle. I sat with him through 2 surgeries and held his hand in a hospice room at 6 in the morning and talked about a cardinal on the porch railing because it seemed important to make his last morning feel like a morning and not a monument. None of that was calculation. I want to say that clearly, and I want to say it to anyone who has ever been told that their ordinary love was a transaction, their simple presence a manipulation, their unremarkable faithfulness something other than what it was. None of it was calculation. It was just being there, choosing every ordinary day to be present in the life I was actually in rather than performing the life I wished I were in. Walter saw that, and he believed it was worth something, not worth the mineral rights, not worth the money. Those were practical decisions a practical man made about the protection of someone he loved. What he believed was worth something was the thing itself, the choosing, the staying, the coffee and the drives and the evenings on the porch, and the nothing that turned out to be everything. I think about Brandon, and I think about what this year has cost him and what it might eventually give him. He is not his father. He will probably never be. But he spent 3 days with a ranch accountant and stayed for dinner with employees whose names he didn't know. And he called the foundation's attorney to set up the charitable giving transfer without being reminded. And last week, Carl Briggs told me that Brandon has started riding the South Pasture on weekend mornings before the ranch day begins. Just riding. No agenda. No deal to close. It is not a transformation. It is a beginning. Those are different things, and I've stopped expecting them to be the same. Connie texted me last month, a short, practical text about a foundation event she wanted to attend, and at the end she added, "Brandon asked me to tell you the ranch signed a 10-year grazing lease with the Mendoza family next door. Dad always wanted to do that. Thought you'd want to know." I read it twice. I texted back one word. Good. Because it was. People ask me sometimes, well-meaning people who have heard pieces of the story, whether I feel vindicated, whether the outcome felt like justice. I have to be honest about this, because the honest answer is more complicated than yes. What I feel is not vindication. Vindication implies that there was a contest with a winner, and the truth is that everyone in this story lost something. Brandon lost the uncomplicated inheritance he'd been building his identity around for 30 years, and has spent a painful year figuring out who he is without that scaffolding. Connie lost the security of a narrative she'd been comfortable inside. Dorothy and Frank lost a brother and spent months watching his family come apart at the seams over money and paperwork and old resentments. And I lost Walter. That loss doesn't get smaller because the estate resolved in my favor. It doesn't get balanced out. Grief doesn't work like a ledger. On the worst mornings, and there are still worse mornings, there will probably always be worse mornings, I would give back every acre of subsurface rights to sit on the back porch again in the evening and watch the light go out of the sky over the South Pasture, with a man who made his coffee too strong and noticed things and told the truth. But here is what I believe, and I say this not as a lesson I am handing to you from a distance, but as something I have arrived at through a year of grief and legal filings and dock repairs and Saturday mornings on a lake that asks nothing of me. Your presence has value. The ordinary, unperformed, undramatic fact of showing up, of being genuinely there in someone's life rather than strategically positioned in it, that is not nothing. The world will tell you it's nothing. The world is structured, in many ways, to tell you that what you own and what you display and what you can leverage is what matters, and that the quiet work of actual love is sentimental and soft and not worth accounting for. The world is wrong. I have watched a man who had the visible prize, the name and the empire and the status he'd spent 30 years accumulating, discover that the visible prize came loaded with the weight of who he had been to earn it. And I have watched a woman who was handed a fishing cabin and told, implicitly, in every way the room could communicate it, that this was the measure of what she was worth. Discover that underneath the ordinary surface of her ordinary life, something valuable had been accumulating the whole time. Not because of strategy, not because of calculation, because of who she actually was when no one was making it worth her while to perform. Walter saw that. He believed it. He built his last act around it. I am sitting on the porch of a cabin on a quiet lake, and the foundation is running, and the scholarships are out, and the hospital clinic is back on its route, and the heron comes most mornings, and there is a screw in the dock that's slightly off angle, and the new board is weathering in. I planted what I could tend, and I tended what I planted. And I'm going to sit here for a while in the specific silence of a place that asks nothing of you. And I'm going to think about a man who made his coffee too strong and knew exactly what he was doing. And I am going to be, as long as the morning holds, simply here.